Okay, everyone, hope you're doing well. This is the topic related to data assurance or audit analytics or audit data analytics. Uh, it is an important topic because this is, I believe, the future of auditing, honestly. Between this and IT audit, I believe these two are going to be the most important pieces of the audit eventually. So let's go ahead and see what we have on tap for us today. We'll spend a few minutes talking about kind of this big data revolution we've had in business and in kind of in our society here, because it kind of sets the stage for what we mean by data analytics. And we'll think about analytics as it relates to firms, as it relates to users and regulators, before we dive into how it relates to the audit. Okay, so that's where we're heading. Big data is ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. It's a term used to describe this large portfolio of data that's growing exponentially, right? We'll see some graphics here in a minute, but the goal in its application in the business world is to improve productivity, improve profits, improve risk management, essentially how data is being used to change the way firms are managed. And this is taken from the EY article that was part of your assignment or assigned reading. And so this is an important area for business. I think that's not too much of a surprise to anybody at this point. This graphic just gives a sense about the different sizes we're talking about of data. We're kind of used to thinking megabytes and gigabytes and even terabytes, but when you start thinking about some of these large corporations and the data they store, you're thinking more in petabytes. You're thinking about Google, Amazon, some of the Google especially. You think about exabytes and some of these other large, even below, we can go beyond that, right? These last three, Google Byte, and so we have some pretty large amounts of data. This is a way to think about it. If you represent the amount of data that could be stored in a tablet, I'm trying to think of this as I can't remember if this was like an 8 gig or 16 gig tablet or something, and then you stack those tablets. You could have gotten it 2/3 of the way to the moon about 7 years ago. At this point, we could go to the moon and back over 6 times. 128 gigs for iPad was the benchmark. So that's an incredible amount of data that we have rolling around in our phones and our laptops, on the web and servers. And so, it's pretty astounding what has happened just in the last 7 years. And then you think about the different companies that kind of specialize in big data: Google and Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, might using massive amounts of data to try and provide services and products to companies. And so, I don't think we need to keep going, but you get the idea. Some pretty startling numbers. So, what about data analytics? That's the process. Analytics is the process of analyzing data with the objective of drawing meaningful conclusions, right? And so, the key thing for us is thinking about analytics from a decision usefulness standpoint, right? So, you can have data, but it doesn't become data analytics until you actually are applying data to a decision you're trying to make or someone else is trying to make, right? Another way to think about this is the transformation between data and information. You can have a lot of data floating around, but to actually pull it together, synthesize it in a way that is helpful for an individual, then that's when it can become information, okay? And so the idea is that we're going to try and use data to help make decisions within the firm. And so a couple of underlying principles here. The requirement is that for this to be analytics is you really need like a systematic process here in order to create reliable information out of data. We can find correlation. So if correlation is when two things move in a predictable pattern. So the idea that the number of customers and the amount of sales, right, those are positively correlated. The more customers you have, the more sales you should have. It's not causation, but it's correlation. And so data analytics is good at doing that. You can have negative correlations as well, right? The more customer complaints we have, then probably the less profitable we're going to be, right? Or the firm would be. It would be an example of a negative correlation. So overfitting can occur with data analytics if you're not careful. And so there's a great quote from a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he said, essentially, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to something, right? And so if you splice the data and look in, enough areas or subsamples or, transform the data enough in certain ways, then oftentimes you can find a statistically significant result, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is useful, right, for a decision. And then kind of the last thing is this idea that context really matters. So what's the context in which you're going to apply the information? So you may develop some insights in one context that may or may not apply in another context, right? So you have to be careful about that. All right, so those are some general comments about data analytics. Now let's start thinking about it from the different stakeholder groups. So first with firms, there's some change in business models here. Think about utilities. Chances are most of you pay utilities. In the past, you'd get a meter being read once a month or once a quarter, some infrequent amount. The new model is using, the Internet of Things to set up meters that can communicate wirelessly, and so you don't necessarily need someone going around to every house. I know some utilities, for example, they actually put a communication equipment on a truck, and they just drive the truck around a neighborhood, and they can collect all the information, right? Eventually, so that's probably kind of the in-between model, and then the extreme model will be Internet of Things, where each meter can actually connect to the internet wirelessly, right? And so now this allows the utilities to manage electricity use in a much more dynamic way than they were before. Retail, if you think about the retail industry in terms of how it approached customers, obviously now there's a lot more information around. Just think about Amazon. This is the perfect example, right? Where they're basically looking at correlation of purchases, and that's why when you make a purchase or even when you view something, Amazon has all these suggestions for you. Well, it's using data and correlations between what other customers have ended up buying if they looked at that item, and so they're able to give you essentially customized marketing, right? That's what Amazon specializes in, is it gives you customized marketing based on either your history or a combination of your history plus other people's history. Auto insurance is another one. It used to be you'd have certain characteristics, and so based on those characteristics you were priced. If you were a young male, then usually you got the worst deal, because the category of young males are the ones that were resulting in the most accidents. Now they have sensors, right? You can put in your car. I know Progressive has one. There's probably other companies that are doing this as well. I've used them, and you basically plug it into your onboard computer in your car, and essentially collects information around driving patterns. Progressives essentially looked at hard stops when you were basically decelerating, so fast, above some threshold, like you're your deceleration speed, the magnitude was above a certain amount, feet per second or miles per second or whatever it was, and then it would record that, right? And so you got a beep when I did it, and so every time you did it, you would get a beep. So you kind of got trained as to what is it trying to look for, but it also is sending that information wirelessly to Progressive, and then it can give you an individualized discount or premium based on how well or how poorly you drive, right? So it's changing these business models. Okay, so if we look at how it impacts some jobs here, this is an estimate from a I can't remember if it's a book or an article, and it basically was looking at the probability that kind of this increased automation and data analytics and all this kind of wrapped together is going to lead to job losses. Obviously, some places or some careers you're not going to be able to get a machine to do it, right? I'm not going to trust a machine to go into my mouth and and do any dental cleaning anytime soon. Even though I'm sure they're getting better and better. But you get all the way down, you look at us for accountants and auditors, I think they, and that looks a little worrisome. I would say, though, probably more so on the accountant side than the auditor side, even though there is some, definitely some inroads for data analytics with auditing. I would say that you're going to see more likely that the job losses are at the accountant side, where a lot of the transaction processing, entering in accounting information, doing the accounting cycle up to a point, that's where you're going to see more and more reductions, right? As we get more and more automated in terms of how information makes it into the AIS, the accounting information system, then you'll see definitely some job losses there. But I think the higher level positions, how do you interpret the accounting information? How do you design an accounting information system, at least conceptually? Doing audits, which are not easy to do, and even though there's definitely some inroads from analytics, there's still going to be some role for individuals to be a part of that process, to be sure. Oh, and then this was just kind of the distinction between this man versus machine idea versus, so some of you, whoops, all right, I got a little carried away. The man versus machine, if you recognize HAL, the HAL 9000 from Space Odyssey 2001, it was a good movie where the machine basically turned on the people it was supposed to be helping to more of a symbiotic kind of relationship. Is kind of one of the conclusions of this article, was this is where we kind of need to be heading, right? Where we're using technology. And if you don't know that picture on the bottom right, then I'm not sure what I can do to help you with that. You've just missed out on a major cultural treasure. So anyway, the healthcare, for example, is one where the artificial intelligence is being used by doctors to help them diagnose, but it's not replacing doctors, right? That's a good example. And so we need to make sure that accountants and auditors, especially auditors, start doing the same thing, trying to incorporate the information to help and give more insights and get more efficient with the audit. And I think that's where we're going. So PwC actually put out this paper around skills that were required. And by the way, a lot of this slide deck was from Ernst & Young. I used it because they have it's one of the ones I came across a few years ago, but please don't take that as an endorsement of E&Y versus others. But PwC has put out things, KPMG, Deloitte, all these firms have put out different information around how analytics is going to impact the profession. And so if you imagine this 2x2 where you have the ability to produce analytics on the bottom axis and the ability to consume and understand and interpret analytics on the Y, then you don't want to be in the quadrant where you can't produce analytics and you can't consume it, right? If you can consume it but can't produce it, they're saying you have a capability gap. And if you can produce it but not understand it, so for example, you're a computer science major and you can you can code a lot of things, but you don't understand the purpose of a lot of the things you're actually doing, then you have a behavioral alignment gap in terms of not being able to understand what you're producing. So EY and even PwC, when they did their white paper, kind of argued that you really need to be in this upper right quadrant to where you can produce it and consume it. My encouragement to you is I think an overall engagement team needs to be in that upper right quadrant of doing value creation. And it's okay if you're in one of these quadrants in terms of the off diagonal of technical capability or behavioral alignment gap, as long as you have some appreciation for the other element, right? So you don't want to be in the very extreme corners of each of those, but it's going to be really hard to get really good at both producing the analytics and being great at understanding and how to interpret and how to design the analytics, right? So it's going to be hard for you to be an expert in both. So my encouragement is just that you make sure you're not in the extremes of those two gap quadrants. And then you make sure if you're, for example, if you become a manager or senior manager, you make sure that your engagement team can ultimately get to that upper right quadrant, right? And I think that is kind of the best we can do. I think it's really, really hard for you individually to be in that upper right-hand quadrant. And so just consider that.